literally come from nothing. I had zero. I didn't have anyone even paying for college. I took that, through loans. I didn't have anything. So how did I build my own personal wealth? That's all I can share with people. And what I wanted to do was put that into a book and put the solution into a book to where I 100% believe if I can get this into the hands of teenagers, young adults, if they apply just the basic lessons that I teach in the book, they will at least be able to live a good quality of life.
Rob, welcome to the Book Thinkers Life-Changing Books podcast. How are you feeling today?
Good, man. Nick, thanks for having me. Excited to talk to your audience.
Yeah, man. Congratulations on this book. So I want to kick off by reading your dedication to my audience, and then I want to ask you a couple of questions. So you were able to share an early copy of the book with me, and the dedication reads, "I dedicate this book to everyone who is trying to improve their life and the lives of their families. Education is the greatest equalizer I know. Please use this information to take action." Now, action is the word that I'd like to kick off today's podcast with. Why do you feel like so many people read books like this, but choose not to take action on the information that they're reading?
Well, not to promote you too much, Nick, but I think this is going to be right down your alley because if you look at all those books that are on your shelf, I've got plenty of them behind me. I think all far too many become I call them self-shelf books, right? Where they're sitting there doing absolutely nothing. And a lot of times people don't even get through the first 2 or 3 pages. They have all that good intention, or they get through it and they don't know how to act and turn that into action. And in particular, I think a lot of us reading personal finance books and books on building business, how do we monetize that? That's the most important thing. And so I don't want people to just read this and do nothing, because that's not going to change anything. And I'm trying to, the book's called Close the Wealth Gap, and we all close your wealth gap. And we all know this wealth gap in America of the rich getting richer, poor getting poorer is only getting worse. And the only way that's going to change is through action. And that's what I do in the book. I give very actionable steps of how you can start implementing and changing things right away.
Yeah, so I was going to ask about that. You just kind of gave me a nice lead into it. When you were writing the book and you had this idea of, I want to help people take better action, were there any strategies for the book that you implemented around helping people create better action? Like, you've mentioned reading a bunch of these books yourself. What's the difference between an author who writes an actionable book and somebody who just writes philosophy and inspiration and motivation, but fails to help their reader out a little bit?
It's a great question. I think that's kind of one of the problems with education in general today. It's this kind of this ivory tower philosophical idea of something that you need to do. But I think today in particular, with the speed of change, people are frustrated with those types of learning lessons. They want to know kind of the nuts and bolts, cut through all the crap. What did you do? What are other people doing that I can do? And so what I tried to do in the book, Nick, was just cut through all the BS, give them the actionable plans. I even took, all this very complicated financial theory, broke it down into some simple shortcuts. And then I also, whether you're zero, I mean, you have a baby that was just born, or you're 60 years old and you're behind, I gave specific strategies. And I even gave sample portfolios for people to go out and invest in and start doing something right away. So my goal, and I talk about at the beginning of the book, I didn't want anybody to not have any excuse not to take action by the time they were done reading it.
Yeah, and I love that answer. I think that's great. I hope that more authors continue to write books through the lens of helping their readers take action in the future. That's becoming my whole brand. And so that energizes me. The other thing that energizes me about this introduction is when you say education is the greatest equalizer I know. And so I'd like to dive a little bit into your backstory in just a minute, but I wanted to share with you and with my audience that I got into this personal development space, mostly books, because I read Rich Dad Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. And in that book, that's a good book. I think it's a good introduction as far as financial literacy is concerned. But what Robert says in the beginning is that money is a subject that's not typically taught at school. So we're not all on an even playing field. It's taught at home. And so if you grow up in a home with poor and middle class parents, you will learn poor and middle class money habits. You have to go out there and learn from somebody like you or from somebody like him how the actual game of money works so that you can be better set up to close that wealth gap that we're talking about today. So yeah, I'm happy that you put it out there, and I'm happy that you're highlighting that education is the great equalizer. So here's my next question. Are you a bigger believer in traditional education, public school, college, or in self-education, reading books like this and learning through your own experiences?
Well, look, I mean, I've got 4 college degrees on on the wall, so I obviously believe in traditional education. However, I'm more a believer and advocate of the right type of education, and so I'm still one of those maybe dinosaurs left that I think, look, coming out of high school for an 18-year-old kid, for me, a 4-year degree was probably the best thing I could have done because I didn't even understand. I wasn't even educated enough to know how to learn. I think that's one of the things that college does for somebody at 18 years old. It puts you into a different mindset. It opens your mind to be able to learn. However, I think, look, I'm 49 years old. So the opportunities for me back then in 1993 were way different. We had dial-up internet back then. So, YouTube was just coming out. And so the available information today that you can get for free, in many cases, I would argue, is actually better than what you're going to get from the traditional financial educational system. So I don't really care how you get it. And, the idea of college sucks or this sucks or whatever it is, I think the most important thing is that you find the information that is directly related to what you're trying to do in life at the highest level. And it's information that you're able to act on. I think that's the most important thing, Nick.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I think sometimes I'm guilty of discrediting a traditional college experience and maybe the US public education system, although I am a product of both of those things as well. And I turned out just okay. Maybe a little bit too much college debt without fully understanding what it was there for. But that's the importance of financial literacy, which is what the topic of our conversation is today. So let's go back in time. There's something that caught my attention early in your book when you said, I'm just like you. So people in the audience today, they might think, oh, this guy, Rob, he's talking about wealth management firms. He's 49 years old. He's got 4 college degrees. He's writing a book. I can't relate to him. But then you say, you had to feed and clothe yourself at 11 years old. So let's jump back to 11 years old. What was life like for you back then?
Yeah, and Nick, it was something quite honestly when I wrote the book, I struggled like, do I want to put that backstory in there? Is it necessary? And the reason I say that is because look, I had a pretty challenging life, and I'll give you the 10,000-foot overview on it. But I've also traveled to places like India, and I've seen what poverty really is. Being born into a caste system really is, where you have no opportunity to change things. I also am healthy, I have 2 arms, 2 legs. So my backstory, I feel, compared to people who've done way greater things that I have, is very minimal. However, again, this book is about getting past the excuses, and I want to understand people to understand that I don't really, subscribe to that idea of all the excuses that paralyze us. So look, yeah, I grew up in Los Angeles during the 80s, 90s. Very heavy gang violence back then. I lost a brother at an early age to gang violence, and I was born into a family where financial literacy was far from it. We would move from, I probably lived in 18, 20 different homes during the period of time. We'd get into somewhere new until the eviction notice would go to somewhere different. Yeah, my mother was a drug addict, and I was, out on the streets selling some illegal things. And then I started selling candy door to door, and washing cars, whatever it took. But I grew up in an environment where very, very, very difficult, kind of by the grace of God and sports that got me out of that environment, got me into college, out of Southern California into Arizona. And it was one of those situations where I didn't know what I was going to do. Like I said, I believe the grace of God put me into this financial services space as an intern very early in college. And I just kind of realized, look, hey, this is my opportunity to change my life. And I might only get one chance. I've seen what happened to other people. Let me go all in on it. And that's kind of what I did. I committed my whole life to being the best in, personal finance. And I maybe arrogantly feel I could sit in the room with anybody and talk about it.
Well, I do think sharing this backstory makes you more relatable, like I was highlighting. I mean, we've interviewed a lot of very high-powered entrepreneurs, business celebrities, authors, people just like you. And at first, somebody like you or Cardone or PBD is a little unrelatable. But
Yeah.
then once you kind of take the superhero cape off and you kind of go back in the day and you realize it wasn't a beautiful beginning. You weren't given this giant, inheritance or something like this on day one. You had to go out there, scrap, and make it for yourself. So speaking of kind of like the scrappy startup, there's 2 things that I related to. One is door-to-door selling. The other is wrestling. So let's unpack both for a minute. I know you were really young, but door-to-door selling candy bars, what experience did you learn during that period of your life that's kind of transferred to where you are today?
Yeah, I mean, it's the truth is it's one of the I think the greatest lessons I had. I started, it was a company called the Student Work Program. And I was just talking to somebody else. I don't know how legit it was. Like we'd get out of school, this dude would pull up with his cargo van. We'd all have these boxes up into there, no seat belts or anything. And this was back in, the 80s where we were selling Kit Kat bars for like $6 back then. So you can imagine with inflation, that's like a $20 Kit Kat bar. And we would go door to door and I would do that 6 days a week. And I did it for about 4 years and you'd get like $2 on every candy bar that you sold. And you can imagine like when we'd get out of school at 3. So at the heart of when we're knocking on people's doors is right in the middle of dinner. You're there to sell them, a really expensive candy bar. They don't want to hear it. And so overcoming objections, understanding how to relate to people. I remember I kept getting shot down like, oh, we don't eat candy. It became this like go-to excuse. Oh, we don't eat candy. We're trying to be healthy. Okay, okay, okay. So then I went back to the guy and told him, I said, is there something else that we can sell? So then we started selling chamomile tea. So then I learned how to overcome objections and have another product to be able to sell and offer to them. My sales started to skyrocket. And then later on, we introduced a coloring book for people who had grandkids. And so you just learn, resourcefulness. You learn how to look. You've got to knock door after door after door. You never know which one's going to be open and lead to your next 20 candy bar sale. And so, just, overcoming adversity, being tenacious, getting out there and understanding and relating to people, I think was a huge opportunity for me at a young age.
Yeah, I love that, man. I can see you light up when you talk about it. And that's how I feel when I talk about it too. I ran my own house painting business in college for 2 summers. I drove back every weekend at school, gave up a lot of the partying so I could go door to door. And I'd
Yeah.
have to generate my own leads and then go back and provide a formal estimate for these thousands and thousands of dollar, per deal job. And man, it was the best experience I've ever had selling. So I can totally relate to that. The other thing I wanted to talk about was wrestling. So I was also a wrestler, and I think it's the toughest sport on the planet for a high school student. And I learned so much as a captain of our wrestling team, wrestling in states, but also just the sport in and of itself. So I'd love to have you maybe share one or two lessons from wrestling.
Yeah, I think it's the same thing. First I started wrestling pretty late. I was actually a sophomore in high school.
Me too. Yeah, that's funny.
That's what I tell my wife. First of all, I was worried about vanity, so I always wore headgear. But I don't have the cauliflower ears because I didn't wrestle long enough. But the coach kind of saw me in the weight room. I was always lifting weights, and he said, "Hey, why don't you come out and try this?" And I think especially in high school, I did pretty good. Well, then when I went, try to do it in Division 1, it didn't work out quite as well for me. But look, I think just as first the discipline, having to cut weight, stick to your diet, the fact that look when you got out there, I think the thing about wrestling or maybe boxing, yeah, you're part of a team, whether that's a school or whatever it is, but it's that kind of individual one-on-one where 100% of the effort that you put into it is 100% of the effort that you're going to put out to it. So I think the biggest thing was the discipline, and I learned very early I didn't like getting pinned. I didn't like
Mhm.
losing. And so whatever I had to do to get better at it is what I did. And so I think a lot of that, maybe not just wrestling. I think any sport. I think it's a great thing to get your kids into sports these days, as long as it's not the kind that are giving everybody a trophy. Because look, I think again, like some of the challenges I had going door to door, I think losing, getting knocked off my pedestal when I went into college. I came out of high school thinking I was pretty good, was something where I learned, look, hey, unless you do everything you need to do, commit to be the best, you're not going to be the best. And sometimes what you're trying to do in life, it might not be the right thing for you. You might need to pivot. In which my case, I wasn't going to the UFC, so I pivoted into finance, and it was a good thing, that I did at the time that I did.
Yeah, well, I'm sure a lot of those skills that you learned and developed through wrestling have transferred to exactly where you are today. So I'm right there with you. For the second half of the conversation, I think we should talk a little bit more about why you wrote the book. And then I'd also like to take an interesting spin and talk a little bit about how it can serve entrepreneurs, which make up a big majority of my audience. So who is this book for? Why the heck did you decide to write it?
Yeah, so the truth is, I probably wouldn't have written it now because I've got so many things just like you and everyone else going on. But Wiley called me about a year ago and said, "Hey, we've been following you. There's this big issue about the wealth gap in America, and we think that you could be a voice that resonates with other people. So they wanted me to write a book about closing the wealth gap. And so I thought about that for a minute, and I said, look, I'll do it. However, I don't want it to be such a broad-based book about the wealth gap in America. I think there's a lot of information on there. And at the end of the day, the people who are most impacted about that, yeah, they don't care so much about the wealth gap as they do their own personal financial situation. And that's why the book became Close Your Wealth Gap. And so, I hear all this stuff about the wealth gap in America. I've been hearing about it for 15, 20 years, but the problem is trying to be fixed through solutions like government handouts and things that I don't really personally believe in. Again, because of my background, when I got into wealth management and they told me, hey, Rob, go ahead and call the 10 or put your list down of the 10 most wealthy people that you know, and let's call them to open an account. Well, that was really quick because I didn't know anybody. And so I had to do dinner seminars and all these crazy things. And so a lot of times people ask me, Nick, well, how did you become wealthy? What did you do to get out of where, you were at? And the only way I was able to do that was by building a business, which is what we'll talk about here in a minute. But so when I looked at this situation, what I wanted to do was everything that I was able to do to literally come from nothing. I had zero. I didn't have anyone even paying for college. I took that, through loans. I didn't have anything. So how did I build my own personal wealth? That's all I can share with people. And what I wanted to do was put that into a book and put the solution into a book to where I 100% believe if I can get this into the hands of teenagers, young adults, if they apply just the basic lessons that I teach in the book, they will at least be able to live a good quality of life. They won't be living, there's a stat out there that says 56% of Americans couldn't meet $1,000 emergency from their savings. That's a huge problem. And so what I wanted to do was give the lessons that I believe, if implemented, will change that and close the wealth gap.
Yeah, I love that. And we talked a bit about action to kick off the show, but close, right? That's an action, it's a verb. You're trying to help people take action and close that gap. And, my audience, all credit to them. They are not the type of people who play that victim mentality, right? Like, oh, there's this big wealth gap. I'll never be able to overcome it. They're actively looking for resources just like your book so that they can take better action and close the gap themselves. I'd like to read one more thing from your book, and then we'll talk about entrepreneurship. You say that financial literacy is gaining and or accessing the knowledge that is required to optimize all the financial decisions you will need to make during your lifetime. By consistently making wealth maximizing decisions, it will allow you to achieve your highest quality of life in the fastest possible time frame. And so for me, when I think about financial literacy, we're all forced to play the game of money. So you might as well be good at it, right? We're not talking just food, water, shelter, but a lot of us, especially in the book thinkers community, we're talking about making an impact, donating money and time to things that we care about, building a life for our family, and a life that uniquely fulfills us. And I think a lot of times that does happen through entrepreneurship. There's a lot more financial flexibility once you start to build a business, offload a lot of the poorly leveraged stuff, and start focusing on highly leveraged activities. So why do you think this book could be a good fit for an entrepreneur, and why is financial literacy even more important in entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I think they both go hand in hand, right? There's a lot of great entrepreneurs out there that are able to build a great business and get great cash flow going, and they learn everything they need to do there. However, and I just was talking to one of them other day, a guy who's made millions and millions of dollars over his lifetime, but didn't realize until his late 40s, well, hey, in order for me to continue to live this lifestyle, eventually I'm not going to be able to do some of the things I'm needing to do. And because of the fact where I always relied on the ability to go out and create a great income from my company, but never did anything on the personal finance side, now I'm in a pretty bad position. And so the idea is, how do you, from the beginning, understand that when you create this business, eventually, no matter how much we love that business, no matter how much of an impact we're making, we're going to get tired. We're going to get older. We're going to not want to work as hard. We're not going to want to do as many podcasts, as television shows, cold calls, door knocking as what we did in our early 20s. And we're going to want to maybe do that on a part-time basis and eventually kind of retire. And so what are the actions we need to do early on to expedite that track and make sure that we're not 40 years old saying, and this is what I really try to do in the book, if I only knew then what I knew now. And that's really the idea about knowledge, is eliminating that statement for your vocabulary, getting that information at an early age so you can avoid making those mistakes for 10 or 20 years. And I think we all know the magic of wealth building is compounding over time. So you need to start making those decisions early. And I'll just, say this, I made the vast majority of my money from selling my previous business, from selling equity in two businesses that I run now. I've done great in real estate, I've done great in stocks, but nothing even remotely compares to that. So the other thing when you're building that business is understanding from a personal standpoint, when does that business get to a valuation or cash flow perspective where I can sell all or a part of that, and that number makes an impact in my personal life. And so that's one of the things that I teach entrepreneurs at an early age is, what does your ideal lifestyle look like? Like, really look like? What does it cost? The house that you want, the cars you want to drive. Let's quantify that. It's a cool thing about math. We can do that. And then I can tell you what you need to have in a passive portfolio to be able to fund that. And when I sold my business the first time, it was the fourth offer that I actually accepted because I knew what my number was. Now, ultimately, it wasn't the number that where I could just put my head down and not show up in the world, but it was a number that was enough to where I said, well, God, I could really screw up from now on, and I'm actually going to be able to do okay. And so that's the important thing for entrepreneurs is understanding, what do you need personally? What are you trying to achieve from this business personally on the personal finance side, to make sure everything you're doing is strategically in conjunction with that personal goal? Because at the end of the day, I always tell people businesses are just about people, and people have different goals, they have different time frames. And so what you really need to understand is you build that not only for yourself, but what are your employees trying to do? And I think far too often people separate the personal side of their own personal financing commitment with the business side, and that's where you start to see mistakes being made.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to continue working my way through your book and applying it to my own situation, because here I am in my late 20s realizing the importance of exactly what you are talking about. So as I build my business, I just got married earlier this year. As we build sort of our portfolio moving forward, I think the advice in your book is going to be very useful to us as individuals, but also to me as a business owner. So I'm excited for that. And you just said something that I think is really interesting, and I might have to steal it once in a while in some content or something. You said you're trying to eliminate the phrase, if only I knew then what I know now. And that's exactly what these books do, right? It's condensing decades of your lived experience, the obstacles you've overcome, the lessons that you've learned, into days of reading. And that's the best kind of time hacking that I'm aware of, right?
Yeah, that's why I was interested. I've actually, we talked a couple of weeks ago, and I've been doing a few other podcasts as the book is coming out, and I've actually been speaking about your book, because when you told me that, and I hear about a lot of things, but when I heard about them, like, it's such a great concept, right? Because I think especially now, there's so much information, so many great books out there, but unless you know how to really take that and act upon it, it's not going to do much, right? And that statement, and I always say, Nick, by the way, just quote me twice and then it's yours. So if you want to use it, it's all yours. But that's, really about what all this information is. And I'll give you just one example from the book. I talk about this 30-year millionaire rule, where all you got to do is put 125 bucks away, and you could do that from some part-time side hustle. You could always come up with 125 bucks. Do that, and in 30 years, just in an S&P 500 cheap fund, you'd have $1.2 million. Right. So now everyone's gonna say, oh, that's not what it used to be. That's one of these excuses. 1.2 million. Well, the average person has like 30,000 when they retire. So if you can do that in 18 years, well, I'm sorry, in 30 years, well, if you start at 18, you're 48 and you got 1.2 million. By the way, if you put that in a Roth IRA, it's tax free. Right now, but if you do that at 50, you're 80. Right. So it's like getting that information. Or I teach my clients and people, do that for their kids, write it off as a deduction if you're a business owner when they're 5 or 6. So then by the time they're in their early 30s, they've got 1.2 million tax free. Same information. It's just how soon you can get access to that and apply it. And I tell people this, Nick, and it's like I gave them the cure for solving the Israeli-Palestine crisis. Right. It's just getting them the right information and getting them to act earlier. That'll allow them to compound those wealth maximizing decisions.
Yeah, I came across a quote recently from Napoleon Hill that said, action is the real measure of intelligence. I wish I put it in my book. I came across it later than that. But I think you're right. you have to take action. And imperfect action is better than not taking action at all. So starting today, like if somebody's listening to this podcast, make sure you get a copy of Close Your Wealth Gap. Make sure you read it. Make sure you implement it. I mean, everybody's sick and tired of hearing me talk about action, but it's so important, and repetition leads to retention. That's a
Right.
lesson that I teach all the time. So I'm going to repeat that until everybody's like, we get it, Nick. But it's really important. It's like the person that chooses to listen to this today and take action on what you're talking about is the same person 30 years from now that's going to say, I'm so happy I did that. And then they're not financially stressed out. They're not worrying about money anymore. And they're like, shout out, Rob. Thank you for teaching me this. So I think it's super important.
Love that you have this audience that's younger. It's a little more difficult when I'm talking to 60, 65-year-olds who come and say, hey, Rob, I've got 100,000. How do I make this work? And it's a little bit difficult, but you're in your 20s, early 30s. It's so easy to put yourself in a position where you're not going to even miss it if you take the right action, use the right strategies. By the time you're in your 50s, 60s, you're going to have a comfortable lifestyle. But it's getting the information, like you said, acting on it.
All right. I have four more questions, and they'll be quick questions. Number one, if somebody's listening today and let's say they're in their late 20s, early 30s, we're talking about personal, not business. What's one piece of advice, one kind of foundational thing that they have to put in place today, other than $125? What's one additional tip that you have?
Yeah, well, that's definitely one thing. Open up a Roth IRA, what I would say with that, because if it's, it gets about 168,000 is your max now, but in your early 20s, you might not be you're probably not making more than that. But as you get older, you won't be able to contribute to that. You'll be maxed out. So while you're making a little money, get that Roth IRA. All the growth is tax free. There's not a lot of tax free investments out there. Do that. But what I would say, the best investment that you can make is what you're talking about. I'm talking about is in yourself. Make sure you're getting the information to take action. There's no one who's going to care more about your money than you do. Get out there and start a business. For me, for all my clients, it's been the fastest path to wealth. Start doing something.
Okay, so for those that had, this is question number two, for those that have started businesses, what's one foundational thing that a lot of people are missing that you'd recommend they start doing today?
Yeah, build it with enterprise value in mind, meaning build a business that's sellable, that somebody's going to want to buy for you. That means not buying yourself a job. A lot of entrepreneurs don't build a valuable business. They bought themselves a job and they don't realize it until they're stuck in that job. There's no value to it. So I always tell people work right to left, meaning take a look at, if you're a landscaper, whatever your business is, look at other businesses that are being sold, that are out there right now, like PitchBook's one of them. We get sort resources. You can go and see, hey, landscaping companies are being sold for 3 to 4 times earnings. Take a look at what those businesses are being sold for, reverse engineer to say, okay, if I want to get 5 million or 10 million for my business, what do they look like? And then start today building that foundation to get there in 10 or 15 years. So that way, if you're in your 20s, 30s, by the time you're 45, you built a 10 or $15 million asset that you're able to sell. Far too many people just buy themselves a job. They're not building a valuable business.
Yeah, I certainly made that mistake when I first started Book Thinkers. I did not start with the end in mind. I just started. And so I think take the time to build with enterprise value, like you're talking about. That's such a great suggestion. And it's easier to do that from the start than try to rework a business that's already flowing.
I'm one of those products of, if I only knew then what I knew now. I built my business. I started at 27 out of my bedroom, and I didn't really understand what scaling was. And I started going. At 38, I went back and did my MBA, primarily because I needed to understand the scale and how to create enterprise value. But I can quantify, and I tell people, if I had that information when I built it, I probably would have gotten about 35 to $40 million more for my business. But as you said, I became a victim to my pricing, to some of the things that I set up in the beginning that I would have been able to do completely different. That it's very hard to go back and tell employees, hey, you got to take a 50% pay cut. Hey, customers, we're going to triple what you're doing. So start it from the beginning with that end in mind, and you're gonna do much better. I promise you.
Yeah, I love that. All right, second to last question. Other than your upcoming book, what book have you gifted the most over the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, I'm maybe a little biased, but a professor of mine at Wharton, Jeremy Siegel, wrote a book called Stocks for the Long Run. I think if you want to learn about the stock market in general, which I always tell people, whether or not you're going to invest in stocks, you have to understand it because it's an indicator of what the economy is going to be doing. You have to understand stocks. Stocks for the long run by Jeremy Siegel is probably my favorite book on the stock market.
All right, great. I have not read that. I don't own a copy, so I will pick one up. And I mean that. Last question. So this is my co-host Luke's famous question, but since he's not here, I'll try to ask it myself. So he likes to say, imagine that your book, all of your social media content, everything you've ever written down, it disappears. And you're only able to leave the world with one message. What would that message be?
I think that message would be to believe and bet on yourself, right? I think far too many people are looking to other people to solve the problems for them, and at the end of the day, I think one of the you asked, about my background. The one, if I had to point to one reason that I believe I was as successful as I am, not as successful as I want to be, was the fact I never had a safety net. I only had myself to fall back and believe on. So I knew, and that's why I spent so much money, college degrees, courses, books, to make sure that I was the best at what I did. So make sure that you believe and bet and invest in yourself.
Yeah, I love that. And I support that message 1,000%. I think the audience they're going to enjoy that as well. Okay, for people that want to pre-order a copy of your book or order a copy of your book, we'll have a link in the show notes below, as well as links to your social media and everything. But it's nice to hear it from you as well. Where should people go? What should they do? How do they get in touch? What's the
Yeah.
next step?
You can, so one thing, you can go to closeyourwealthgap.com. It's got a link to everywhere, but go to your favorite bookstore, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million. To me, it doesn't matter where you get it. I just want you to get it. And most importantly, if your parents are going to be parents, share it with your kids, because as you said, this is not being, I don't know why, but it's still not being taught in schools.
Yes, fact. All right. Well, thank you so much, Rob. Appreciate your time today.
Thanks, man. See you soon.